The rain had been falling since morning, turning the streets into long gray rivers that reflected the lights of expensive cars outside the Grand Harmonia Hotel. People hurried under umbrellas while workers rushed in and out of the building carrying flowers, instruments, and boxes for the evening's event. Inside the hotel, everything looked bright and perfect. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished floors, and soft piano music played through hidden speakers in the lobby. Near the back hallway, away from the guests and cameras, a young woman pushed a cleaning cart slowly across the marble floor. Her sleeves were rolled up, and a few strands of hair had escaped from the loose knot behind her head. She looked tired, but her eyes moved toward the ballroom every few seconds whenever music drifted through the open doors. The hotel was preparing for the biggest event of the month. A world-famous pianist was arriving that evening for an exclusive performance. Wealthy guests from different cities had already begun checking in. Reporters waited outside. Even the hotel manager looked nervous. But none of that changed the young woman's work. She still had tables to clean. She still had dishes to carry. And she still had to smile politely whenever someone snapped their fingers for service. As she wiped fingerprints from a glass door, two waiters nearby talked excitedly. "I heard tickets cost more than most people earn in months," one whispered. "They say he's the greatest pianist alive right now," the other replied. "People cry during his performances." The young woman stayed quiet, but she listened carefully. Music had once been the center of her life too. Years ago, before bills and responsibilities filled every corner of her days, she had spent hours practicing piano in a tiny house far away from the city. Her mother gave lessons to children in the neighborhood and believed music could heal sadness. Every evening their old piano filled the house with melodies, even during difficult times. Back then, the young woman dreamed of performing on a real stage someday. But dreams changed when life became harder. After losing both parents within a short time, everything collapsed quickly. The piano was sold. The house was gone. School ended. Survival became more important than music. Now, years later, she worked long shifts at the hotel just to pay rent for a small room above an old grocery shop. Still, she never truly stopped loving the piano. Sometimes during breaks, she stood quietly outside the ballroom doors just to listen to musicians rehearse. Even hearing a few notes made something inside her feel alive again. That afternoon, the ballroom buzzed with activity. Workers adjusted lights while hotel staff arranged expensive decorations across round dining tables covered in white cloth. At the center of the room stood a grand black piano under a golden spotlight. The young woman entered carrying fresh towels for the backstage area. She tried not to stare at the piano too long, but it was impossible. It looked beautiful, smooth, perfect, like something untouched by real life. One of the stage workers noticed her looking. "Careful," he joked. "That piano probably costs more than this entire floor." Several people laughed lightly before returning to work. She smiled politely and kept walking. An hour later, most workers left the ballroom for lunch, leaving the room unusually quiet. The young woman returned to collect empty water bottles from backstage. As she finished, she glanced around carefully. No one was there. Her eyes slowly moved toward the piano again. For a moment, she simply stood still. Then, almost without thinking, she walked toward it. Her footsteps echoed softly across the empty ballroom. Up close, the piano seemed even larger. She hesitated before gently brushing her fingers across the smooth surface. Dustless, cold, perfectly polished. Her heart beat faster. She looked toward the doors one more time before carefully sitting on the bench. At first, she didn't touch the keys. She simply stared at them, white and black, familiar, like old friends she had not seen in years. Then finally, with shaking fingers, she pressed one note. The sound floated softly through the ballroom. A second note followed. Then another. Soon a quiet melody began filling the room. Slow and emotional. Not flashy or loud, but full of feeling. Her shoulders slowly relaxed as the music carried her somewhere far from the hotel. Far from trays, uniforms, and endless shifts. For those few moments, she wasn't a worker cleaning floors. She was herself again. The melody grew softer near the end, almost like a whisper. Then suddenly, clap, a single clap echoed from the doorway. The young woman froze. An older man stood near the entrance holding a maintenance toolbox. His gray hair peeked out beneath a faded cap, and deep lines marked his face. He looked surprised but impressed. "You stopped too soon," he said gently. Embarrassed, she stood quickly. "I'm sorry. I wasn't supposed to touch it." The man shook his head slowly. "Most people hit piano keys," he replied. "You listened to them." She lowered her eyes, unsure what to say. "I used to play a little," she admitted quietly. "A little?" The old man smiled faintly. "No, not a little." Before she could answer, voices approached from the hallway. She immediately stepped away from the piano. The old man picked up his toolbox again. "Don't let dusty dreams stay dusty forever," he said before leaving. His words stayed in her mind long after he disappeared. That evening the hotel became crowded with wealthy guests dressed in expensive suits and glittering dresses. Cameras flashed outside the entrance as the famous pianist finally arrived. People rushed to welcome him. The young woman watched from behind the front desk while carrying folded napkins. The pianist walked confidently through the lobby without looking at anyone around him. Several hotel employees whispered excitedly as he passed. He looked exactly like someone the world admired. Expensive coat, perfect posture, calm expression. But there was something cold in his eyes too. The manager practically bowed while guiding him toward the private rehearsal room. "Everything has been prepared exactly as requested," the manager said nervously. The pianist barely nodded. As the night continued, the young woman worked non-stop serving drinks during a private dinner for important guests attending the concert. Laughter and expensive perfume filled the ballroom. While placing glasses onto a table, she overheard several guests discussing talent and success. "True greatness is something people are born with," one man said proudly. "Most people could practice forever and still never become special," another replied. The young woman stayed silent as she moved between tables. Later that night, after guests moved toward the concert hall, she carried empty trays backstage near the rehearsal room. Through the slightly open door, piano music poured into the hallway. The famous pianist was practicing. The speed of his hands looked unreal. Even from a distance, the performance sounded powerful and sharp. Every note was perfect. The young woman paused for only a second to listen. Suddenly the music stopped. The pianist noticed her standing outside. "What are you staring at?" he asked coldly. She immediately looked down. "Sorry, sir." But before she could leave, one of the organizers laughed lightly. "She likes piano music," the man explained. The pianist studied her for a moment. "You play?" he asked casually. The hallway became quiet. The young woman hesitated. "A long time ago," she answered honestly. A few people nearby smiled in amusement. The pianist leaned back slightly with a faint smirk. "A hotel worker with hidden talent?" he said. "Interesting." More quiet laughter followed. Her face warmed with embarrassment, but she kept holding the tray tightly without responding. The pianist turned back toward the piano. "Well," he said carelessly, "maybe we'll hear you someday." The others chuckled again. The young woman forced a small polite smile before walking away, but the laughter followed her down the hallway. Inside the storage room, she placed the tray down carefully and stood still for several seconds. She had heard that kind of laughter before, the kind that reminds people exactly where the world believes they belong. For a moment she considered crying, but she didn't. Instead, she slowly sat on a small wooden chair near the shelves and stared at her hands. Hands that once practiced scales for hours. Hands that once played beside her mother in a tiny house filled with music. Hands that now carried plates and cleaned tables. Outside, applause suddenly erupted from the ballroom as the famous pianist began his performance for the crowd. The young woman listened quietly through the walls. And deep inside, something painful began waking up again. The concert ended close to midnight, but the hotel still buzzed with energy. Guests stood in small groups talking excitedly about the performance, while workers rushed around collecting empty glasses and folded napkins. Outside the ballroom, Reporters waited near the entrance hoping to catch a few words from the famous pianist before he left. The young woman moved quietly through the crowd carrying a tray filled with dishes. Her feet hurt from standing all day, and her shoulders felt heavy, but her mind stayed trapped on what had happened earlier in the rehearsal room. A hotel worker with hidden talent? The pianist's mocking voice kept replaying in her head. The laughter hurt even more, not because strangers laughed, but because a part of her still cared about music enough to feel embarrassed. As she entered the kitchen area, another waitress nudged her gently. "You heard him talking about you earlier?" she whispered. The young woman forced a small smile. "It's nothing," but the waitress looked uncomfortable. "People can be cruel when they think they're important," she said softly before walking away. The young woman stayed quiet. She finished cleaning until almost 2 in the morning before finally leaving the hotel through the back exit. Rain still covered the streets, though lighter now. She pulled her thin jacket tighter and began the long walk home. The city looked different at night. The noise disappeared. The fancy buildings became silent. Even the expensive hotel behind her no longer looked magical. It was just another building full of strangers who would forget her face tomorrow. She climbed the narrow stairs to her small rented room above the grocery shop. The room held only a bed, a small table, a kettle, and a weak lamp near the window. In one corner sat an old notebook tied with a faded ribbon. She stared at it for a moment before slowly picking it up. Inside were handwritten music notes, melodies she once created years ago. Some pages were wrinkled from age. Others held tiny stains from tears or spilled tea. She turned the pages carefully like someone touching pieces of a lost life. Then she stopped at one unfinished song. Her mother had helped her begin it long ago. "You play with feeling," her mother once told her. "That matters more than showing off." The memory hit her hard. She quickly closed the notebook and looked away. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the sky. The next morning arrived too quickly. By noon, the hotel was crowded again because the famous pianist would perform a second concert that evening. Everyone seemed even more excited than before. Clips from the first performance had already spread online overnight. Guests spoke about nothing else. The young woman tried focusing on work, but her exhaustion made everything harder. She nearly dropped a tray during breakfast service. "Careful," the manager snapped. "Important guests are here." She apologized immediately and continued working. Later that afternoon, the hotel manager gathered several workers near the ballroom entrance. "The pianist requested complete privacy before tonight's performance," he announced. "No interruptions, no unnecessary noise, and absolutely nobody touches the piano." As everyone nodded, the manager's eyes briefly landed on the young woman. The message felt personal. She lowered her gaze quietly. Hours later, she carried fresh towels toward the private rehearsal room again. The hallway outside stood empty except for soft piano music drifting through the door. The melody sounded different today, sharper, angrier somehow. As she passed by quietly, the music suddenly stopped again. The door opened. The famous pianist stepped into the hallway holding a cup of coffee. He recognized her instantly. "You again," he said. She froze politely. "I'm just bringing supplies, sir." He looked at the towels in her hands before leaning lightly against the doorway. "So," he said casually, "do you still practice?" His tone carried amusement more than curiosity. She hesitated. "Not really. Probably for the best," he replied. The words landed harder than she expected. Before she could answer, 2 wealthy guests approached the hallway excitedly asking for photographs. The pianist immediately smiled for them, becoming charming within seconds. The young woman walked away quietly while their laughter echoed behind her. Near the storage area, she stopped beside a window and took a slow breath. Why did his opinion matter so much? He was just a stranger. But deep down, his words reopened something she had spent years trying to bury. The old maintenance worker appeared nearby carrying another toolbox. He noticed her expression immediately. "Bad day?" he asked gently. She tried smiling. "Just tired." The old man studied her for a moment. People who gave up on their own dreams often enjoy crushing someone else's. he said. She looked surprised. You heard what happened? Hard not to, he replied. The young woman looked down at her hands again. He's right though, she admitted quietly. I stopped playing years ago. I'm not a real musician anymore. The old man leaned against the wall thoughtfully. You know what the saddest thing is? He asked. Not failing. Not losing. The saddest thing is convincing yourself you were never meant for something you truly loved. She stayed silent. Then he surprised her. Come with me after your shift tonight. She looked confused. Where? The ballroom. Her eyes widened immediately. I can't. You can. We'll get fired. The old man chuckled softly. At my age, getting fired isn't very scary. For the first time all day, she almost smiled. Night arrived quickly, and once again the ballroom filled with wealthy guests dressed in expensive clothes. Cameras flashed while soft music played during dinner service. The famous pianist sat at a private table surrounded by important people praising his talent. The young woman avoided looking in his direction. But fate had other plans. During dessert service, one of the guests suddenly called out loudly. Wait! The man laughed. Isn't she the piano girl from yesterday? Several nearby guests turned toward her immediately. Her stomach tightened. Another guest smiled with curiosity. Oh yes, I heard about that. She plays too, right? Before she could escape, the famous pianist himself looked over calmly. She says she used to, he answered with a faint smile. The group laughed lightly. One woman lifted her phone playfully. Maybe she should perform tonight. The pianist smirked slightly. Maybe she should. More laughter followed. The young woman felt heat rush into her face. She tried stepping away politely, but one guest pointed toward the stage. Come on, he said. Just one song. Others nearby began watching now. Some looked amused. Some simply looked curious. The room suddenly felt smaller. The pianist slowly stood from his chair. Well, he asked calmly, why not show us? The guests clearly expected entertainment. Not music. Entertainment. The young woman's hands trembled around the tray she held. I'm working, she said quietly. Oh, don't be nervous. One guest laughed. The pianist walked toward the stage and lightly touched the grand piano. Music should be shared, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Now even more people turned toward them. The room filled with whispers. The young woman wanted to disappear, but refusing completely somehow felt worse. Slowly, she placed the tray onto a nearby table. Her legs felt weak as she walked toward the piano. Some guests already raised phones to record. Others smiled expectantly. The famous pianist stepped aside with crossed arms. Please, he said dramatically. The young woman sat down carefully on the bench. The ballroom became quiet. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She tried breathing steadily, but dozens of eyes stared at her, waiting, judging. The silence became unbearable. She pressed one note, then another, but her hands shook badly. The melody in her mind suddenly disappeared. Her breathing quickened. A small mistake slipped out. Someone in the crowd chuckled. Then another mistake. More laughter followed. Her vision blurred slightly. The pianist watched silently from nearby. She tried again, but panic completely took over now. The notes fell apart. Finally she stopped playing altogether. The ballroom sat in awkward silence for one painful second before scattered laughter spread through the room. One guest shook his head while smiling. Another whispered loudly, well, that explains the cleaning job. Several people laughed harder. The young woman immediately stood from the piano bench. Her eyes burned with humiliation. The famous pianist gave a small shrug as if proving an obvious point. Not everyone belongs on stage, he said calmly. That sentence cut deeper than all the laughter combined. Without saying another word, she hurried away from the ballroom while voices and laughter followed behind her. She didn't stop walking until she reached the dark employee hallway near the loading dock. Only there did she finally lean against the wall and close her eyes tightly. Her chest hurt, not because strangers mocked her, but because for one tiny moment, she had actually hoped. A few seconds later, soft footsteps approached. It was the old maintenance worker again. He looked at her face and immediately understood. "They made you play?" She nodded silently. For a moment, anger flashed across the old man's eyes, but his voice stayed calm. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Fear ruined that performance, not lack of talent." She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. "No," she whispered. "They were right." The old man shook his head firmly. "No, they only saw someone scared." She looked away. "I'm done with music," she said quietly. But even as she spoke those words, something inside her knew they weren't true at all. The next morning, the young woman almost didn't go to work. She sat on the edge of her bed staring at the floor while sunlight slowly entered through the small window of her room. The sounds of the busy street below drifted upward, but she barely noticed them. Her mind stayed trapped inside the ballroom from the night before. The laughter, the whispers, the way people looked at her after she failed. Worst of all was the pianist's voice. "Not everyone belongs on stage." She kept hearing those words again and again. For a moment, she thought about quitting the hotel completely. She imagined walking away and never returning. No more trays, no more rich guests, no more music. But rent still needed to be paid. Life did not stop because someone's heart hurt. So after a long silence, she stood up slowly, tied her hair back, and prepared for another shift. The streets were crowded by the time she reached the hotel. Large posters of the famous pianist still hung near the entrance. Guests continued arriving from different cities, hoping to attend the final concert scheduled for the next evening. Everything outside looked exciting and glamorous. Inside, she felt empty. As soon as she entered the employee hallway, conversations suddenly became quieter around her. A few workers looked away awkwardly while others gave small sympathetic smiles. Word had spread. Everyone knew what happened. One waiter approached carefully while arranging clean glasses. "Don't let those people get to you," he said softly. She forced a polite nod. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Throughout the morning, she moved through her tasks like someone carrying invisible weight. Even simple things felt harder now. Every time she passed the ballroom doors, her stomach tightened. During lunch service, two wealthy guests sitting near the lobby recognized her. "That's the girl from last night," one whispered loudly enough for her to hear. The other chuckled. Brave attempt, though. She kept walking without reacting. Still, every comment felt like another stone added to her chest. Later that afternoon, she escaped briefly to the back storage room just to breathe in silence. She leaned against a shelf and closed her eyes. That was when she heard slow footsteps nearby. The old maintenance worker entered carrying a toolbox as usual. "You look like you haven't slept at all," he said gently. She gave a tired smile. "Maybe I haven't." He set the toolbox down carefully. "You're avoiding the ballroom." "I'm avoiding embarrassment." The old man crossed his arms thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "the audience last night didn't laugh because you lack talent." She looked unconvinced. "They laughed because people enjoy feeling superior," he continued, "especially when someone vulnerable stands in front of them." She stared quietly at the floor. "I froze," she admitted. "I couldn't even remember the notes." "That happens. Not to real musicians." The old man smiled faintly. "Oh, it happens to everyone. You think famous performers never panic?" She didn't answer. He leaned slightly closer. "Fear can erase years of practice in seconds." A long silence followed. Then the old man surprised her again. "Meet me tonight after your shift." Her eyes narrowed carefully. "Why?" "I want to show you something." "I already told you," she sighed. "I'm done with music." "No," he replied calmly. "You're hurt. That's different." Before she could respond, someone called her name from the hallway. Her break was over. That night the hotel remained busy, though calmer than the previous evening. The famous pianist stayed inside a private suite preparing for interviews and rehearsals before his final performance tomorrow. The young woman avoided every hallway near him. Near midnight, most workers finally clocked out and left. She considered going straight home too, but the old man's words stayed in her mind. After several minutes of hesitation, she quietly walked toward the ballroom. The large room sat dark and empty now except for a few dim wall lights. The grand piano remained under the spotlight like a silent giant waiting in the middle of the stage. The old maintenance worker stood near the front row adjusting a small lamp. "You came," he said with a smile. "Only for a minute. That's enough." She stayed near the doorway nervously. "What exactly are we doing?" The old man walked slowly toward the stage. "Listening," he answered. Then he sat at the piano bench himself. To her surprise, he placed his fingers gently on the keys and began playing. The melody was simple but beautiful. Not perfect, not flashy, but warm, human. The young woman stared in shock. "You play?" she asked. The old man laughed softly while continuing the melody. "Played," he corrected. "Long ago." When he finished, silence filled the ballroom again. "I used to teach music," he admitted quietly. Her eyes widened. "You were a teacher?" "For many years." "Then why are you working here?" The old man smiled sadly. "Life changes." Something in his voice told her not to ask further. He stood slowly from the piano bench and motioned toward her. "Come." Immediately she shook her head. "No. You're afraid of the wrong thing." She stayed frozen near the doorway. The memory of last night still burned inside her. The old man understood. "Nobody's here," he said gently. "No audience. No phones. No rich people waiting to laugh." Still she hesitated. Then finally, very slowly, she walked toward the stage. Every step felt heavy. When she reached the piano, her hands trembled slightly again. The old man noticed. "Don't perform," he said quietly. "Just play." There was a difference. For several long seconds, she simply stared at the keys. Then finally she sat down. The room stayed completely silent. No cameras. No whispers. No judgment. Just her and the piano. She pressed one soft note. Then another. At first the melody sounded uncertain, almost fragile. But gradually her breathing slowed. The music became smoother, warmer, more natural. The old man watched quietly without interrupting. The young woman closed her eyes for a moment while playing. Memories returned slowly. Her mother humming beside the old piano at home. Rain against tiny windows during evening practice. Childhood dreams she once believed in completely. Without realizing it, emotion began filling every note. The ballroom transformed. The empty chairs no longer mattered. The expensive hotel disappeared. For the first time in years, she forgot to be afraid. When the song finally ended, silence lingered in the room. The old man smiled softly. "You see." She looked down quickly, almost embarrassed. "I made mistakes. Music isn't built from perfection," he replied. "It's built from feeling." She stared at the keys quietly. "I used to practice every day," she admitted after a while. "Before everything changed." The old man sat in the front row listening carefully. For the first time, she spoke openly about her past. About the tiny house where music once filled every evening. About her mother teaching children for little money. About losing both parents only months apart. About selling the piano because survival mattered more than dreams. Some parts were difficult to say aloud. But once she started speaking, the words kept coming. The old man never interrupted. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "That pain stayed inside your music," he said. She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "People who never struggle can play perfectly and still sound empty. But someone who lived through loss," he paused gently, "that becomes part of every note." Her eyes lowered again. "No one wants emotional music anymore," she whispered. "People only care about fast hands and big performances." The old man chuckled softly. "That famous pianist downstairs has incredible skill," he admitted. "But last night, during his performance, do you know what I noticed?" "What?" "Not one note felt honest." The young woman looked surprised. "He's world famous." "Yes," the old man said calmly. "But fame and truth are not always the same thing." A long silence followed. Then suddenly footsteps echoed faintly from outside the ballroom. Both of them looked toward the doors immediately. The young woman's heart jumped nervously. But it was only a security guard doing his rounds. After he left, she released a quiet breath. The old man smiled knowingly. You're still scared someone will hear you. Maybe. That fear will disappear slowly. She looked doubtful. I'm not sure. The old man stood and picked up his toolbox again. Come back tomorrow night after work, he said. She blinked. Again. Yes. Why? Because buried talent doesn't disappear, he answered. It waits. As he walked toward the exit, she looked back at the piano one more time. Something inside her felt different now. Not healed, not confident, but awake. For years, music had been a locked door inside her heart. Tonight, for the first time, it opened slightly again. And somewhere deep inside, a forgotten piece of herself quietly began returning. The following evening felt strange from the moment the young woman entered the hotel. Something in the air was different. Workers moved faster than usual through the hallways. Staff members whispered nervously near the front desk. Even the hotel manager looked pale while speaking rapidly into his phone. At first, she assumed an important guest had complained again. But then she overheard two employees talking near the elevators. What do you mean he can't perform? One whispered. They're saying his wrist is injured, the other replied. Something happened during rehearsal. The young woman slowed her steps slightly. Injured badly? I don't know. But the organizers are panicking. A strange silence settled inside her chest. The famous pianist injured? That seemed impossible somehow. People like him always appeared untouchable. She continued toward the service area, while workers rushed around carrying decorations and equipment for the final concert. Tonight's event was completely sold out. Wealthy guests had traveled from different cities just to attend. If the pianist truly could not perform, the hotel faced disaster. Near the ballroom entrance, the young woman spotted the old maintenance worker adjusting a light stand. He noticed her expression immediately. You heard? He asked quietly. She nodded. Is it true? The old man sighed softly. Looks that way. Before she could ask more, the hotel manager stormed past them with two event organizers close behind. We cannot cancel this concert, one organizer whispered urgently. What choice do we have? Another replied. People paid thousands. The manager rubbed his forehead in frustration. Find someone. Anyone. Their voices disappeared down the hallway. The young woman exchanged a quick glance with the old man before returning to work. But throughout the evening, tension spread across the entire hotel. Guests continued arriving in expensive clothes, unaware that chaos was building behind the scenes. Inside a private rehearsal room, doctors and assistants moved in and out constantly. Rumors spread quickly among staff members. Some said the pianist strained his wrist from overpracticing. Others claimed he slipped while leaving rehearsal. No one knew the full truth. By sunset, the ballroom glittered with golden lights while waiters prepared tables for dinner service. Soft music played through speakers, but nervous energy filled every corner of the room. The young woman carried trays quietly between tables, trying to stay invisible as usual. Still, her thoughts kept drifting toward the piano, toward the empty stage, toward the strange feeling that something important was about to happen. An hour later, she entered the employee hallway carrying fresh glasses when raised voices stopped her near the manager's office. We're out of time, one organizer snapped. He says he physically cannot finish a 2-hour performance, another answered. The manager groaned loudly. This will ruin the hotel. Then suddenly another voice spoke calmly. What about a replacement? The young woman recognized the old maintenance worker instantly. The room fell silent for a second. Then someone laughed. A replacement? At this hour? There's no one available, another person replied. The old man remained calm. I know someone who can play. The young woman froze outside the door. No, she whispered under her breath immediately. Inside the office, the manager sounded irritated. This is not the time for jokes. I'm serious, the old man replied. Who? A short silence followed. Then came the answer. The hotel worker. The The young woman's eyes widened in horror. Inside the office, disbelief exploded instantly. You cannot be serious. The girl from the other night? The one who embarrassed herself? More frustrated voices followed. The young woman stepped backward quietly, her heartbeat racing. But then the old man spoke again. You saw fear. I heard talent. That girl is not performing in front of 500 guests, the manager snapped. We only need one thing, the old man replied calmly. Someone who can make the audience feel something before you announce cancellation. The room fell silent again. One organizer sighed heavily. At this point, maybe a short opening piece could calm people down. The manager sounded exhausted now. This is insane. But nobody had a better idea. The young woman quickly walked away before anyone noticed her outside the door. Her breathing became uneven as panic rushed through her body. Perform? In front of all those people? After what happened last time? Absolutely not. She reached the storage room and leaned against the wall trying to steady herself. A few minutes later, the old maintenance worker entered quietly. You should have asked me first, she whispered immediately. You would have said no. Because the answer is no. The old man studied her carefully. You're scared. Of course I'm scared. Her voice cracked slightly. They laughed at me last time. Because you let fear control you. And what if it happens again? The old man stepped closer gently. What if it doesn't? She looked away. I can't do this. Yes, he said softly. You can. She shook her head firmly. No. They want a famous performer. Not a hotel worker pretending to be a musician. The old man remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. Do you know what I noticed when you played alone in the ballroom? She stayed silent. You stopped being invisible. Those words hit her deeply. For years she had felt invisible everywhere she went. At work. In crowds. In life. But at the piano things felt different. Still, fear remained stronger. I'm not ready, she whispered. The old man nodded slowly. Maybe not. But life rarely waits until people feel ready. Outside the storage room, hotel workers rushed past carrying equipment, while guests filled the ballroom with conversation and laughter. Time was running out. Finally, the old man asked quietly, What's really stopping you? The answer came instantly. What if they laugh again? The old man looked at her with surprising seriousness. Then let them laugh. She blinked. People laughed at great artists long before they were admired. Fear of embarrassment destroys more dreams than failure ever will. She looked down at her trembling hands. The old man continued softly. You already survived loss, struggle, and loneliness. Why are you letting strangers in expensive suits decide your worth? Tears threatened her eyes again, but she held them back. The old man gently placed a folded paper into her hand. What's this? Your mother's unfinished melody. Her eyes widened in shock. You left your notebook open the other night, he explained. I copied the notes before you closed it. She stared at the paper silently. The melody from her childhood. The unfinished song. The last piece she ever worked on with her mother. I think, the old man said carefully, that song deserves to be heard. A long silence filled the room. Then suddenly a hotel employee burst through the door. There you are, he said breathlessly. The organizers want an answer now. The young woman's heart pounded hard. The employee looked confused between both of them. Well, every instinct inside her screamed to refuse, to run, to hide. But then her eyes dropped toward the folded music sheet in her hands. Memories flooded back again. Her mother smiling beside the piano. Late-night practice sessions. The dream she buried years ago. Slowly, she closed her eyes for 1 second. Then finally, I'll do it. The words surprised even her. The employee blinked in shock before hurrying away to inform the organizers. As soon as he disappeared, panic rushed back immediately. What did I just agree to? She whispered. The old man smiled gently. A chance. Minutes later, backstage chaos surrounded her completely. Stylists rushed around searching for proper stage clothing while organizers argued near phones. Someone handed her a simple black dress borrowed from another employee. "It's the best we could find," the woman apologized. The young woman barely heard anything clearly anymore. Her hands felt cold, her breathing shallow. Beyond the curtains, hundreds of guests waited inside the ballroom unaware of the emergency happening backstage. Then suddenly, she noticed someone standing near the far hallway, the famous pianist, his wrist wrapped carefully in a support band. He watched her silently from a distance. For a moment, neither spoke. Then slowly he walked closer. "I heard you're replacing me," he said calmly. "Only for one piece," she answered nervously. His expression remained unreadable. "You're brave," he said. She couldn't tell if it was an insult. After a short silence, he glanced toward the stage curtains. "That audience is unforgiving," he added quietly. Her stomach tightened instantly. Then he looked directly at her. "If you walk out there uncertain, they'll destroy you." The words chilled her. But strangely, they also awakened something stubborn inside her. The pianist turned and walked away before she could answer. A few minutes later, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly. The audience quieted. An organizer stepped onto the stage holding a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced carefully, "before tonight's special performance, we would like to present a short opening piece." Backstage, the young woman felt her knees weaken. The old maintenance worker stood beside her calmly. "You don't need to impress them," he whispered. "Just tell the truth through the music." The audience applauded politely outside. Then the organizer looked backstage and nodded. It was time. The young woman took one slow breath. Then another. Finally, with trembling hands but steady eyes, she stepped toward the stage lights. The bright stage lights nearly blinded the young woman as she walked toward the grand piano. For a second, the ballroom felt endless. Hundreds of faces stared back at her from the darkness beyond the lights. Expensive jewelry sparkled across the room. Cameras waited near the stage. Whispering floated through the crowd like moving wind. Many people recognized her immediately. Some guests exchanged confused looks. Others whispered to each other with small amused smiles. A few even remembered the embarrassing moment from earlier and expected another disaster. The young woman felt every eye on her. Her heartbeat pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Still, she kept walking. Backstage, the old maintenance worker watched quietly with folded arms. Nearby organizers looked nervous, clearly hoping the situation would not become another humiliation for the hotel. Near the side curtain stood the famous pianist himself. His injured wrist rested against his chest while his sharp eyes followed every step she took. The young woman finally reached the piano bench. For one terrifying moment, she froze. The memory of the crowd laughing at her returned instantly. Her hands became cold again. What if it happened twice? What if she completely failed in front of everyone? The room waited silently. Some guests shifted impatiently. One man near the front even sighed loudly. The young woman slowly sat down. The piano keys waited beneath the soft golden light. White and black. Familiar. She placed her trembling fingers gently above them. Then she remembered the old man's words. "You don't need to impress them. Just tell the truth through the music." Slowly, she closed her eyes for 1 second, and instead of looking at the crowd, she imagined the tiny house from her childhood. The old piano near the window, her mother smiling softly nearby. The fear inside her chest loosened slightly. Then finally, she played the first note. The sound floated softly across the ballroom. Simple, gentle, honest. The room stayed quiet. Then another note followed. And another. The melody began slowly, almost fragile at first, like someone carefully opening an old forgotten memory. But there was something different in the way she played now. She was no longer trying to prove herself. She was simply feeling the music. The melody grew warmer, deeper. Every note carried emotion she had buried for years. Pain, loneliness, hope, loss. The ballroom slowly changed. Whispers disappeared. Guests stopped moving. Even the waiters standing near the walls became completely still. The young woman kept playing. Her hands no longer shook. The music flowed naturally now, almost like the piano itself understood her story. A woman seated near the front slowly lowered her phone. Another guest leaned forward carefully. The atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted minute by minute. People expecting entertainment suddenly found themselves listening for real. The famous pianist near the curtain narrowed his eyes slightly. Something in his expression changed. Because this was not ordinary playing. It wasn't perfect in the technical way elite musicians often performed. But it was alive. The young woman reached the unfinished melody she once created with her mother years ago. Her breathing slowed. The ballroom disappeared completely from her mind. Now she was no longer performing for rich strangers. She was playing for the life she lost. For the dream she buried. For the little girl who once believed music mattered more than money or status. The melody grew stronger. Her fingers moved faster now, but never rushed. Emotion poured through every note. Somewhere near the back of the room, a guest quietly wiped tears from her face. Another man removed his glasses slowly while staring toward the stage in disbelief. The old maintenance worker watched proudly from backstage. He had seen talented musicians before, but moments like this were rare, because true music did not come from skill alone. Came from truth. The young woman's music filled every corner of the ballroom now. Even the hotel workers near the doors stopped what they were doing just to listen. One waitress whispered softly, "That's really her?" No one answered, because nobody could stop listening. The melody suddenly softened again. Gentle, almost heartbreaking. The young woman remembered sitting beside her mother during rainy evenings while practicing on their old piano. She remembered laughter filling the tiny house before life became difficult. Without realizing it, tears formed in her eyes while she played. But she didn't stop. The audience felt it too. Not just the music, the story inside it. For the first time in years, the young woman stopped hiding from herself. And somehow, every person in that ballroom could hear it. The famous pianist remained frozen near the curtain. Earlier, he believed fear would destroy her. Instead, something else happened entirely. She transformed. The crowd that once laughed at her now sat in complete silence. No phones raised. No whispers. No mocking smiles. Only attention. Real attention. The young woman's hands moved across the piano with growing confidence. The melody rose into a powerful emotional climax that echoed through the ballroom like a storm finally breaking open after years of silence. The final section of the piece carried everything she had never said aloud. Every lonely night, every sacrifice, every forgotten dream, every moment she believed she was invisible. The music became stronger and stronger until suddenly, silence. Her fingers rested motionless above the keys. The final note faded slowly into the enormous ballroom. Nobody moved. Not immediately. For one long second, the entire room remained completely still. The young woman slowly opened her eyes, and what she saw shocked her. No one was laughing. People simply stared at her, speechless. A woman near the front pressed both hands against her mouth emotionally. One older man quietly shook his head in disbelief. The silence stretched another second longer. Then suddenly, applause exploded across the ballroom. Loud, powerful, real. The audience rose from their seats almost together. A standing ovation. The sound crashed through the room like thunder. The young woman looked frozen in shock. She had imagined failure so many times that she no longer knew how to react to success. More people stood. The applause grew even louder. Some guests cheered openly now. Others wiped tears while clapping. Near the walls, hotel workers smiled proudly at each other. Even the organizers backstage looked stunned. The young woman slowly stood from the piano bench, overwhelmed completely. Her eyes searched the crowd uncertainly. Then she noticed the famous pianist. He remained near the curtain, staring at her silently. But the cold confidence in his face was gone now. For the first time since arriving at the hotel, he looked humbled. The young woman lowered her gaze quickly, still unable to fully believe what had happened. The applause continued, and continued. Finally, she gave a small nervous bow before stepping away from the piano. But as she turned toward backstage, something unexpected happened. The audience began clapping even louder. People did not want the moment to end. The young woman felt tears threatening again, but this time for completely different reasons. Backstage chaos erupted immediately once she returned behind the curtains. Workers surrounded her with stunned expressions. "That was unbelievable. Where did you learn to play like that? You have to perform again." Voices came from every direction at once. The young woman barely processed any of it. The old maintenance worker approached slowly through the crowd. A proud smile rested on his face. "You told the truth," he said softly. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks. "I thought I would fail again." He shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "Tonight you remembered who you are." Before she could answer, another voice spoke nearby. "May I?" The crowd parted slightly. The famous pianist stood there quietly. For a moment nobody moved. The young woman's chest tightened nervously again. The pianist looked at her carefully. Not arrogantly this time. Differently. Finally he spoke. "I was wrong about you." The backstage area fell silent. The young woman looked stunned. The pianist glanced briefly toward the stage where applause still echoed faintly through the ballroom. "Very few musicians can make people feel what you just did," he admitted quietly. She didn't know what to say. Part of her still remembered his cruel words from before. But another part understood something important now. His opinion no longer controlled her. The pianist slowly nodded once. "You earned that applause." Then, without another word, he walked away down the hallway. The young woman stood silently while the noise of the ballroom continued behind her. For years she believed her story had already ended. That life had closed the door on music forever. But tonight changed everything. And somewhere beyond the ballroom walls, videos recorded by audience members were already beginning to spread across the internet. By morning, millions of people would know her face. But at that moment, none of that mattered yet. Because for the first time in a very long time, she finally believed in herself again. The young woman barely slept that night. Even after returning to her small room above the grocery shop, her mind stayed trapped inside the ballroom. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the applause again. The standing ovation, the cheers, the sound of hundreds of people rising to their feet for her. It still felt unreal. She sat beside the window while the city slowly grew quiet outside. Her old notebook rested open on the table nearby, the unfinished melody now completed at last. For years she believed music belonged to her past. Now everything had changed in a single night. Her phone suddenly vibrated on the table. Then again, and again. Confused, she picked it up. Dozens of missed calls. Messages from hotel workers. Unknown numbers. She opened one message from a waitress at the hotel. "You're everywhere online right now." The young woman frowned in confusion before opening a video link. Her performance appeared on the screen. Someone in the audience had uploaded it only hours earlier. The video already had thousands of views. As she watched herself playing, more notifications flooded her phone every few seconds. Comments, messages, interview requests, music schools asking questions, concert organizers wanting to contact her. The numbers kept climbing rapidly. She stared at the screen in disbelief. By morning, the video had spread across social media everywhere. People shared clips of her performance with emotional captions. The hotel worker who shocked the world. The woman nobody believed in. The performance that silenced an entire ballroom. Millions of strangers now knew her story. And somehow people connected deeply with it. Not because she was famous, but because she looked real, human, someone who struggled and kept going anyway. The next morning, she walked toward the hotel nervously wearing the same simple clothes as always. But the moment she entered the building, everything felt different. Workers immediately turned toward her. Then applause suddenly broke out near the front desk. The young woman stopped in shock. Several waiters smiled proudly. One cleaner rushed over and hugged her tightly. "You were incredible," she said emotionally. Even the hotel manager approached with a completely changed attitude. Gone was the cold impatience from before. Now he smiled carefully while straightening his suit. "I had no idea we had such talent working here," he said awkwardly. The young woman thanked him politely, though part of her remembered how invisible she once felt inside the same building. Guests staying at the hotel now recognized her too. Some asked for photos. Others simply thanked her for the performance. It all felt overwhelming. Near the ballroom entrance, she spotted the old maintenance worker adjusting a lamp again like nothing unusual had happened. She walked toward him slowly. "You already knew this would happen?" she asked quietly. The old man laughed softly. "No," he admitted. "I only knew people needed to hear you." Emotion filled her eyes again. "I don't know how to thank you." The old man smiled gently. "Easy," he replied. "Don't disappear from music again." Before she could answer, several reporters suddenly entered the lobby asking questions loudly. Hotel security quickly tried controlling the crowd. The young woman stepped back nervously. She was not used to attention. The old man noticed immediately. "Fame arrives fast," he said calmly. "But staying true to yourself is the difficult part." His words stayed with her. Over the next few days, life transformed completely. Music companies contacted her. Professional pianists reacted online to her performance. Interview requests flooded constantly. One famous music academy even offered her a scholarship immediately after seeing the video. The young woman felt grateful but also terrified. Everything moved too quickly. Part of her still felt like the invisible hotel worker carrying trays through crowded hallways. One afternoon, while finishing paperwork inside the hotel office, someone knocked softly on the open door. She looked up. The famous pianist stood there quietly. For a second, neither spoke. The memory of their earlier encounters still lingered between them. But today he looked different. Less proud. Less distant. "May I come in?" he asked calmly. She nodded carefully. He stepped inside holding a small music book beneath his arm. "I'm leaving the city tonight," he said. "Before I go, I wanted to say something properly." The young woman stayed silent. The pianist looked down briefly before continuing. "I judged you unfairly." Hearing those words from him still felt strange. He sighed softly. "I spent years surrounded by competition, praise, and pressure. Somewhere along the way," he paused, "I forgot what honest music sounded like." The young woman listened quietly. "That night," he continued, "you reminded me." For the first time since meeting him, his voice carried no arrogance, only honesty. The pianist placed the music book gently onto the table. Inside, his signature appeared across the first page. "For you," he said. She looked surprised. "I can't accept this." "Yes," he replied softly. "You can." After a moment, she finally accepted the gift carefully. The pianist gave a small, respectful nod. "Don't waste what you have," he said before turning toward the door. Then he stopped briefly. "And don't let applause change you either." With that, he quietly walked away. The young woman stared at the signed book for a long moment after he left. People really could change. Weeks passed. Then months. Her life no longer looked anything like before. She began performing at small concerts across the city first. Then larger events followed. Audiences connected deeply with her emotional style of playing. Critics described her music as honest, raw, and deeply human. But despite growing fame, she never became flashy or arrogant. She still spoke gently, still dressed simply, still remembered what struggle felt like. During interviews, reporters often asked about the night everything changed. She always gave the same answer. "I stopped trying to impress people and started telling the truth through music." Those words spread widely online too. One evening after a successful concert, she returned quietly to the old hotel ballroom long after guests had left. The room stood empty again, just like the first night she secretly touched the piano alone. Only now, things felt completely different. The old maintenance worker sat near the stage drinking tea from a paper cup. He smiled when he saw her. "Big star returns," he joked. She laughed softly before sitting beside him. "I still can't believe all this happened." The old man looked toward the piano thoughtfully. "You know," he said, Most people spend their whole lives hiding who they really are because they fear judgment. She nodded quietly. I almost did too. But you didn't. A peaceful silence filled the ballroom. Then the young woman spoke again. I've been thinking about something. The old man looked curious. She smiled softly. When I was little, many children in our neighborhood wanted to learn music but couldn't afford lessons. She paused. I want to change that for someone else. Several months later, she returned to her hometown for the first time in years. The small streets looked almost unchanged. So did the tiny houses. But this time she arrived differently. Not as someone running away from broken dreams, but as someone finally returning with purpose. Near the center of town stood an old empty community building that had been unused for years. With help from donations and concert earnings, she transformed it into a free music center for children. The day it opened, families filled the small building excitedly. Several old pianos stood inside freshly painted rooms. Children touched the keys curiously while parents smiled nearby. The young woman walked slowly through the center, listening to the sounds of beginner melodies filling the air. Then she noticed one little girl sitting alone at a piano near the window. The child pressed random keys softly before stopping nervously. You can keep playing, the young woman said gently. The little girl looked embarrassed. I'm not very good. The young woman smiled warmly. That's how every musician starts. She sat beside the child and played a few simple notes together with her. Outside the window, evening sunlight slowly covered the small town in gold. And for the first time in many years, the young woman fully understood something important. Her story was never really about proving people wrong. It was about finding herself again after life convinced her she had disappeared. Back in the city, people still talked about the famous performance that silenced an entire ballroom. But the young woman no longer cared about fame as much. Because the greatest moment of her journey was not the applause. Not the standing ovation. Not even the success. It was the moment she finally stopped believing she was invisible. And from that moment on, her music was never silent again.